Hello everyone, my name is Elliot Geltz, and today I have a very special video for you. This is a different topic than what I've already put on the channel, but it's something I'm hoping some of you out there will take an interest in with me. So one of my interests is religious literature, particularly the Jewish Torah. I think it is a very interesting book aside from, well, not aside from, but in addition to its religious purposes for the people that follow its religion, I think it is a very interesting piece of literature to study, both for its spiritual implications as well as its cultural and social implications for the time it was written. Now, that might sound wonky and weird, but just follow me on this. I promise this is going somewhere that I think is cool. So, I like researching and studying and learning about how these stories of different periods of time reflect the people that lived in those times. And from the Jewish Torah, we have the 10 Plagues of Egypt, a story that the vast majority of people have at least a passing understanding of. Even if you didn't grow up in a Jewish or Christian household, nor have you ever partaken in a religion that follows the Abrahamic Bible, you more than likely have a familiarity with the story just through cultural osmosis. I'm going to get into more of the specifics of the story, and I'm going to share how I think it reflects how people saw each other in whatever time period this piece was written. Now, I'm going to put a disclaimer forward first and foremost that I am talking about a piece of religious text in a very secular manner. This isn't meant to be disrespectful to anyone's beliefs or religions. When I say things like whoever wrote this piece or whenever this piece was written, that isn't meant to discredit you if you believe as part of your religion that a certain person wrote it in a certain time period. I'm not saying what you believe is wrong. I'm just making vague blanket statements about the parts of this that aren't as important to get to the parts that are important for the purposes of what we're discussing today. Okay? Okay. So, to start, the 10 Plagues of Egypt take place during a time period where supposedly the Jewish people were in slavery in ancient Egypt under a pharaoh. I believe it's meant to be one of the Ramses. I can't remember specifically. His name isn't particularly important. It's fair enough that he's just Pharaoh for the purposes of our story. So, during this time period, a baby from one of the Jewish slaves was sent down the Nile River so that he could escape a great massacre. That baby was baby Moses, who was found by the Pharaoh's daughter and brought into the Pharaoh's family as an adopted son. Later on in life, baby Moses grew up, as most babies do, and came to learn of his actual lineage as a Jewish person, and feeling horrible about how his people are treated, he sought to free them. Yahweh, the Jewish God, chose him as his champion to set the Jewish people free. Now, to take a pause from the story for a bit, that name Yahweh, which I'm going to say for the rest of the story, might sound strange. Most people are used to the Abrahamic God being referred to as just God. However, the Abrahamic God does have multiple names, some of which are meant to be invoked when you're calling upon him to help you with something specific, and some are just meant to be general purpose when you're discussing him with other people names. One of which is Yahweh. Now, the name Yahweh isn't really real. it so okay. So the actual name of God, God has an actual name, and God being the unknowable eldritch entity that he is, I almost said a word that was significantly more offensive. I'm sorry. God being the unknowable entity that he is, his name would make your brain explode if you read it or knew it. So when scribes were copying and making new copies of the Torah to hand out to the temples, they needed a word to be God's name, like his proper name, without it being his actual name that would make your brain explode. So they took the consonants of what was supposedly his real name and excised all of the vowels and took only the consonants and made a name out of that. Translating the Yiddish to English, you end up with the consonants YHWH. So pronouncing that phonetically, you get Yahweh. And that is treated as God's true name, as a placeholder for the one that makes brains explode. So, with that out of the way, that's why I'm referring to the Abrahamic God as Yahweh. So, coming back to the story, Yahweh chooses Moses as his champion. And there's another dude named Aaron going with Moses who's not as important, but he's still hanging out with him, so he's there too. Moses goes to confront the Pharaoh, his former adopted brother, and demands the Jewish people be let go in the name of Yahweh their God. Pharaoh has no grounding or concept as to how powerful the Jewish God is, so he goes, no, I don't care, get bent. To demonstrate Yahweh's power, Aaron takes his staff and plants it, and his staff turns into a snake. Pharaoh has magicians that supposedly draw their power from the Egyptian pantheon of gods, and they turn their staffs into snakes as well. However, Aaron's staff eats those snakes, thus demonstrating that Yahweh's power is greater than the Egyptian god and goddesses. Now, this is weird, right? Like this is, if you take this literally, which a lot of people take the Jewish Torah / Christian Bible very literally. This is canon Christian text saying that power does come from pagan, air quotes because that's not really accurate, but they would consider it. Anyway, from non-Christian entities. Like the story is demonstrating Yahweh is more powerful, obviously, because his snake ate the other snakes. But those other snakes were still there. Like, the Egyptian gods, following this story, do have the power to do stuff. According to this story, they are real. The implications of that on a spiritual level, that's weird. I don't see anyone ever talk about that part. That's weird. I'm going to make another video later on about all the times the Jewish Torah and Christian Bible inadvertently validate other people's beliefs. But I just wanted to point that out because that's kind of weird and no one ever talks about it. And I might talk about it more later. Anyway, back to our story. Aaron's snake staff eats the other snake staffs, and Pharaoh's like, okay, that's cool, but I'm still not letting your people go. Get bent. So Moses is like, okay, we're going to up the ante a little bit. And the next day he comes to Pharaoh again and goes, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh says no, and by the power of Yahweh, Moses unleashes the first of the 10 plagues of Egypt, which we have here. Now, just to get out of the way, the story goes like this. Each day, Moses approaches Pharaoh, goes, hey, let my people go. Pharaoh says no, and by the power of Yahweh, Moses unleashes a new plague. So I'm not going to say it for every single one, but going forward with the story, just keep in mind that for each one of these, Moses gives Pharaoh an out. Like, hey, the last thing was pretty bad. Before I do the next thing, let my people go. We can end this. That's all Yahweh wants. It's kind of strange in terms of Yahweh's characterization as a facet of the narrative. Because all throughout the Jewish Torah, prior to this and after this, he seems to have a thing about punishment. He was all about punishing Adam and Eve for their first sin in the garden. He was all about punishing Sodom and Gomorrah for being greedy bastards and taking advantage of people. But here he's not really concerned about punishment. He's not concerned about punishing the Egyptians for keeping the Jewish people as slaves. He is inflicting the 10 plagues as a means of twisting Pharaoh's arm and getting him to let them go. If at any point, by Moses' demands of, hey, let my people go, if Pharaoh had capitulated, none of the rest of this would have happened. And that's weird, insofar as it doesn't seem to jive with Yahweh's characterization for the rest of it. However, keep in mind that these are people that are not Yahweh's people. He is trying to free his people from them, meaning that they're not his. Adam and Eve were his people. Sodom and Gomorrah were his people. and they were breaking his laws. Whereas the Egyptians are so far removed from the original body of people Yahweh considered his that now the Jewish people are his, and there's all these other civilizations that are outside of his fold. Which, assumedly, if they had come into his fold, he would be cool with. But because they're out of it, he isn't really concerned about punishing them to follow his laws because they're not subject to his laws. Which that saying that out loud is something you probably wouldn't hear in most circles that research this kind of thing. That's just a point. Also, I should have thrown this disclaimer out. I'm not like a college educated priest or biblical scholar or anything. I'm just a guy who thinks these things are cool. So if I'm wrong and you're someone that is more of an authority on this and you think I'm wrong and you can prove me wrong, I am more than open to that. I am not saying what I think of the story or the comments I make about biblical theology in general. My comments are not like some end all be all stance that is 100% true. It's just what I think. So if I'm wrong, and more so if you can prove I'm wrong, I'm more than open to that. Just wanted to throw that out there. But anyway, Yahweh's relationship with the Egyptian people, insofar as not going to punish them, it's more like he's just trying to free the Jewish people, and he's more than willing to just let this go, and this is all just arm twisting. That's very interesting when you compare it to his characterization in the rest of the Torah's narrative. So, the first plague, Moses approaches Pharaoh, goes, "Let my people go." Pharaoh says no, and Moses touches his staff to the Nile and turns it to blood. Now, this is the beginning of what makes the 10 plagues interesting to me. Because this is a very great feat, like turning a whole river. And the Nile's a big-ass river. Like, if you've never seen a map of Egypt, the Nile just bisects the eastern portion of Egypt. It's massive, it's very wide, and it's very long. There's a joke in there that I am better than saying. But Moses turns the entirety of that to blood. Not just making it red, not just some illusion. He transmutes all of this water to straight up blood. And that isn't just an impressive feat all on its own. It's also a statement. All throughout the 10 plagues, Yahweh is not just making these grand displays of divine power. He's also making very clear statements related to the culture of the Egyptians. He is saying with each one, hey, I'm more powerful than you think I am. Don't mess with me. Here's something directed to the heart of your civilization and your worship. I have power over that. You don't want to mess with me. Each one of these is a forewarning that it can get worse because of how powerful Yahweh is. And these statements aren't just big bombastic displays. They're targeted. They're sculpted to the culture of the Egyptians to make it important to them. Yahweh could have done anything. Like, according to the Torah, he's an omnipotent God. He could have just teleported all the Jewish people away. But that wouldn't have accomplished what he wants. He wants the Egyptians, specifically Pharaoh. He wants Pharaoh to let his people go so this issue stops and he recognizes Yahweh is more powerful so that he won't come for the Jewish people later. So this display isn't just meant to be big and bombastic, it's an attack on the Nile. The Nile River is very important to Egyptian culture, especially the ancient Egyptians who were heavily dependent on its fertility that it provided to the surrounding lands. Without it, Egypt just isn't settleable. Like, you can't live there without the Nile. The ground there is only able to be cultivated because the Nile supplies it with life. There's only water for vast streaks of Egypt because you can draw it from the Nile. It is this cornerstone of Egyptian society and culture. And this is Yahweh specifically displaying, hey, this thing that's important to you, I can take that away. I could take this away permanently. I'm going easy now. Don't mess with me. Let my people go. That's the statement being made with the Nile. Now, as we go on, certain plagues are going to be directly targeted to Egyptian gods. And that's Yahweh displaying, hey, I'm more powerful than this God. You should listen to me when I say, let my people go, because your gods can't protect you. And a bunch of gods are tied up in the Nile, as you see in cultures all around the world. When there is a natural phenomenon like a river or a mountain or what have you, that is the cornerstone of a civilization, that civilization's native pantheon and religious beliefs will typically be centered around that natural phenomenon with a lot of importance tied in it. So, right out the gate, Yahweh is not just making a cultural attack on the Egyptians for this thing that's important to their lives, he is also displaying power over all of the gods that supposedly have power over the Nile or are related to the Nile. He's also saying, hey, all these gods tied up in the Nile, like Osiris with the belief that the Nile was his bloodstream, and a whole bunch of other gods that are supposedly in or have power over the Nile, he's saying, hey, I'm stronger than all of them. You should listen to me when I say, let my people go. That's the running thing here. So, the first plague doesn't really work. Pharaoh's still like, nah, that's not a big deal. The, the river that's a cornerstone of his civilization turning to blood, nah. Moving on to the second plague, we have a plague of frogs. Just millions and millions of frogs that descend on the Egyptian people. So when I say frogs show up and they're annoying, that doesn't really sound like a big deal, but I'm talking about millions and millions of frogs. Like so many frogs that every single household in the entire kingdom just has hundreds all up in the walls, all over the floors, all over your shelves, knocking your shit over, all up in your food, all up in your water that you have for drinking and bathing. Like they're all up in everything. And that sounds annoying. And when I say it's annoying, that makes it sound like not a big deal. But like for the entire period of time this plague has befallen the land, just everything you could do in your life, just being in your house, frogs are all up in that, croaking and tearing up your stuff. And it doesn't sound like a big deal when it's supposed to be the divine retribution of a god. But keep in mind, Yahweh is still keeping things small time. We're still in the ballpark of the smaller plagues that are just meant to be harassment of the people to say, hey, I have great power that you should respect. I can up the ante. Let's cut this out before things get worse. Insofar as displaying power over an Egyptian god, most people agree that the plague of frogs is related to Heket. Now, another disclaimer, I looked up how to pronounce the majority of these Egyptian god names prior. I already have a passing interest and familiarity with Egyptian mythology. I'm still not an expert, just it's a thing I think is cool and like to read about. So I've done my best to pronounce these correctly. If I'm wrong, I'm sorry. Please don't burn my house down or something. So, most people agree that the Plague of Frogs is an attack on Heket, a goddess of minor healing that is typically presented with the head of a frog. Now, it's important to note that she's not really associated with frogs as a body of animals. She doesn't really have power over them. It's more so frogs are her symbol, her icon. All of her talismans and objects of worship typically had frogs engraved upon them. So that's why, and also she's presented as having the head of a frog. That's why frogs are associated with her, and this is Yahweh saying, hey, this minor deity of yours, I have power that's greater than hers. Her icon, that's under my domain. So, the plague of frogs doesn't work. Yahweh steps up to the third plague, a plague of biting insects. This means lice and ticks and minor little annoying bugs that can pester you as you go about your day. A whole plague of them befalls the land. And just like the frogs, no matter where you go or what you do, you can't escape them. Now, what's interesting is this is a step up in the display of power. With the first plague, Yahweh transmuted one material to another, water to blood. And with the second plague, he conjured a bunch of animals that were already in existence. All the frogs throughout Egypt, he congregated into one area. With this, he is transmuting unliving material into living creatures. He is making earth, he is taking dirt itself, and forming it into living insects. That is a step up in the display of power. So that doesn't seem like a big deal. It seems like we're just arguing semantics, but there is an escalation here. And part of this plague is the message of, hey, like I said the last two times, I'm upping the ante. You should listen to me before things get worse. The Egyptian god Geb is associated with the earth, and he is believed to have had power over the earth itself. So this plague is like Yahweh taking the material that is supposedly Geb's to have domain over and doing something that you wouldn't associate Geb's power with. Showing, hey, I can do more with this thing your guy supposedly has dominion over. So once again, displaying he has greater power than the Egyptian gods and upping the ante in the power he's displaying. Moving on to the fourth plague. A plague of flies descends on the land. Now that sounds a lot like the third plague if you don't live in Egypt or Northern Africa or the Middle East or any other kind of place. What's the difference between biting insects and flies? If you live somewhere like North America or Europe, it can even sound like flies are a lesser punishment. Like you would associate biting insects with mosquitoes or something. However, these are gnat flies. Or they go by multiple names, but like gadflies and other names. But anyway, they are these horrible, horrible little monster creatures that are massive and have massive jaws for a fly and have no fear of man or anything he can do to them, and will just land on you and bite you and rip off a little chunk of your flesh. They will just eat you. They don't give a shit. They will just attack you willy-nilly, and they don't care if you can swat them, because you probably can't. They're super evasive, so they'll just fly up and rip off a bit of you. They're awful. So imagine a whole swarm of those descending on the populace and literally attacking them. It's important to note at this point that we should draw a line. I didn't have enough space for it. A line between the third and fourth plagues, that we have stopped having plagues that also affected the Jewish slaves. The Jewish slaves had to deal with the Bloody Nile and all that. However, starting at this point, the plagues are targeted. They are no longer afflicting the Jewish slaves and the populace. So if for some reason there was still doubt that this was the work of Yahweh, the Jewish God, the plagues just magically not afflicting his people, that should tip you off that, yeah, this is the big man Moses is talking about. The flies are a display of power over a goddess named Wadjet, which, again, I'm trying my best here with the pronunciations. Cut me some slack. I'm sorry if I'm getting things wrong. Wadjet is not necessarily a provider deity in that she has power over flies like this. It's more so she's a guardian. So the Egyptians, this is a gross oversimplification, but you could divide a lot of the Egyptian gods into providers and protectors. Gods that had power over something and provided it to the Egyptian people, and protectors that had power over something and protected the Egyptian people from it. One of Wadjet's responsibilities as a goddess was she was meant to protect the people from outbreaks of these flies. So Yahweh is demonstrating, hey, this lady you worship, she cannot protect you. I have power over the thing she is supposed to protect you from. Once again, branching out and displaying, my God, shoot me, displaying power over things the Egyptian gods were supposed to protect them from. Moving on to the fifth plague, we have a pestilence that afflicts the livestock of the Egyptians and kills all of their cows and sheep and every farm animal they keep. This is the first one to really hit hard with like long-lasting consequences, because like the Nile was blood for a day. A bunch of annoying animals showed up. A bunch of flies showed up and attacked us for a day. These are things that were annoying for a bit, and then something that did hurt the Egyptians, but they could heal from and forget about. This is the first thing to have long-lasting consequences. We are past the point of, okay, this was kind of annoying. If you just let my people go, it's all good. Even if Pharaoh let the people go now, the Egyptians would be suffering for a while as they try to rebuild their farms and get back their populations of livestock. So this is the first point where we're going to have long-lasting consequences, even if things end. But still, Moses is every time going, hey, let my people go, assumingly with the promise that he would keep, that the plagues would stop, and Pharaoh goes no. So once again, it's his own fault. He should once the flies are only attacking the part of the population that doesn't worship this god. You, like to me, I could believe him not believing the first three. It's with the fourth he should start to swivel. But it's with the fifth where you really start to look at Pharaoh like the idiot in this situation. Now, speaking of that, it's a very common misconception that I want to address. There is a verse in the Torah that most people translate to God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which most people mean to believe that God was deliberately somehow both directing Moses to inflict the plagues to convince Pharaoh to let his people go, and at the same time reaching down and making Pharaoh so spiteful and so bitter that he wouldn't let his people go. As if this was like illusion magic or mind manipulation Yahweh was casting on Pharaoh. However, that's not the case. That's I don't mean to, like I said before, I'm not a college educated expert. I didn't go to seminary school or anything like that. So I'm reluctant to say flat out that's wrong in regards to another person's interpretation of the Torah or any literature like this. But that's wrong. That is just straight up a mistranslation. Or rather, it's an accurate translation that is so vague, the actual meaning is lost and open to wrong interpretations. A more accurate translation is Pharaoh was so bitter that just the thought of God hardened his heart. Like, even in the face of all of these punishments, when Pharaoh thought of Yahweh, he was so bitter and resentful that he was willing to say no and keep the Jewish people in bondage, despite the suffering of his people. That's just how bitter he was. That's what that's meant to mean. It's not Yahweh was playing both sides and making this happen. It's Pharaoh was just a brat about it. So anyway, back to the plagues. The affliction of the livestock is associated with Hathor, who is a very preeminent goddess. She is wife to Ra, mother of Horus, and a very prominent figure in the Egyptian pantheon. It is important to note that there are multiple gods and goddesses, like the Nile, associated with livestock. The reason this attack is associated with Hathor is that's our next escalation. Is we have seen attacks on more minor gods or more fundamental gods, but Hathor is a part of the Egyptian royal family as far as the pantheon is concerned. Like she's wife to Ra, who is considered king of everything and the first pharaoh. She is mother to Horus, who is considered a great hero and another of the most preeminent gods in the pantheon. So for Yahweh to come after her next is him going up the rungs of the ladder to take a swing at gods significantly more important in the working of things. Moving on from the fifth plague to the sixth, we have boils that break out over the Egyptian people. Now, this is the first time Yahweh has directly afflicted the people themselves. He has conjured animals to attack them. He has done things to their infrastructure and their natural resources. He has afflicted their livestock. This is the first time Yahweh has directly hurt the Egyptian people themselves. Now, there's a whole bunch of healing gods. Even Heket from before is considered a healing god. However, as far as escalation is concerned, this is considered an attack on Isis. Now, okay, my mic is plugged in. I was about to have a heart attack that I had to redo like half an hour of recording. Anyway, this is considered an attack on Isis because, and this is an interesting story in its own right, alongside this, I want to say Egyptian mythology is wildly fascinating. I love it dearly. I'm absolutely going to do videos on it in the future. I highly recommend you go and research it on your own and read it on your own. It absolutely deserves your attention. Such as this story, which I'm going to summarize for the purpose of getting back to the plagues, but it's interesting in its own right. So anyway, there's a story about Isis who wanted more power because she was a very strong healing god, but she wanted more to do more. So she tricks Ra through a whole series of events, who is, like I said, the foremost god of the pantheon. She tricks Ra into giving her his true name, which is like this big bundle of power that he has as the foremost god. It's like he's giving that title, the foremost god, to her. So she tricks him into giving her that, and she becomes the most powerful god in the pantheon. Now, that is an escalation, and it's also a demonstration of what I'm going to get to at the end, and what I'm talking about that makes this so interesting. Whoever's writing this story, which, like I said, I'm not saying whoever's writing the story as an offense if you have a religious belief about who wrote the story. I'm just saying. Whoever wrote the story had a deep understanding of the Egyptian pantheon and Egyptian society. Like, they understood Egyptian mythology enough to know that story about Isis and how important Isis is in Egyptian worship, to the point that we're only getting to her with, like, the back half of the plagues. So whoever wrote this story knew that and was familiar enough with it to work it into this story. That's fascinating to me. So moving on from the sixth plague to the seventh, we have a storm of fire and hail. Now, as far as escalation goes, it's pretty apparent as a demonstration of power. Like, we have pestilences and swarms of awful animals. This is fire raining from the sky. I This isn't said in text. This is just a goofy thing I like to think. I like to think up until now Yahweh was like, as the unknowable entity he is, like standing on his cloud, like, oh my god, they're not listening. How do I up the ante? I'm so tongue tied. I accidentally gave Yahweh my speech impediment. How do I up the ante on the Egyptians? The heck with it. Fire. Fire's coming down. Listen to me, you dumb bastards. I can rain down fire. Do what I say already. And just the idea of him getting fed up and throwing this big apocalyptic rain of fire down. That makes me laugh. So anyway, as far as an escalation over the gods goes, this is interesting. We can make the conclusion that this is meant to be a escalation over two different gods for different reasons, covering two bases at once. So, as far as the sky is concerned, there are a whole bunch of different deities associated with it, even Ra and Horus, who we've mentioned before. However, a being called Nut is considered the sky, like literally the sky. And Nut isn't so much a god in the same way the other figures I've mentioned before are. He's more of a god, like he is the primordial space around the earth made manifest into a sapient being. So the ancient Egyptians believed that the earth was surrounded by a vast ocean of darkness that was just empty space from which spouted everything that exists. And to their credit, they're not wrong. That is a fairly accurate description of what space is around celestial bodies. So good for them, they got that right. Anyway, Nut is meant to be the personification of that space. So for something like this, for a foreign deity to come in and orchestrate power in the space that's supposed to be Nut's, this is an escalation beyond the commonly worshipped pantheon, even the royal family like Ra and Hathor and all of them. This is a demonstration of power over not just a god, but a primordial being thought to be beyond gods. So that's a step up. This is also a step up over Set, who isn't particularly more powerful than certain other figures we mentioned before. Like, he's not more powerful than Hathor or Isis. What this is an escalation over is Set is he's kind of a Loki figure, if you want to make a comparison to another mythology, like Loki to the Norse, in that he's antagonistic, kind of at his most lighthearted trickster, at his most dark-hearted murderer and usurper of thrones. And he's kind of the bad guy. If you wanted to be very reductionist, which I don't want to, but for the sake of getting on with this, if you wanted to make things simple, he's kind of the bad guy of Egyptian mythology. So this is like Yahweh saying, hey, I've shown power over all of your day-to-day gods. I've shown power over your gods' royal family. I've shown power over the primordial beings beyond your gods. If you thought you could run to the bad guy and have him save you, no. I'm also more powerful than him. So if you were so desperate you were willing to turn to the bad guy of your mythology, think again, that's not going to save you. That's the statement being made with this plague. Moving on from the seventh plague to the eighth, we have a horde of locusts, which, if you're unfamiliar with locusts, that might sound like a significant downgrade from rain of fire. Like, how are a swarm of bugs worse than rain of fire? That you would say that if you're not familiar with locusts. Locusts are like hurricanes or earthquakes or tsunamis to other parts of the world. They are a natural disaster so destructive and so awful and so feared they could wipe out entire portions of civilization. Like if you lived in very, very, very ye old times, like 3,000 years ago, or probably even now, like if you were isolated enough in the modern day, you would go, hey, I haven't talked to my cousin Billy in the next village over. I should send him a letter. And you would write a letter and you give it to the mailman, and the mailman would set off about his work. And a few days later, the mailman would come back like, hey, here's your letter back. That village isn't there anymore. It's gone. Locusts, yeah, just wiped them out. And the reason for that is when you look up what a locust is, you'll see a grasshopper. Which, oh, grasshoppers, if you live in North America or wherever, oh, those adorable little things have the weird bendy legs, and we make children's stories about them, where they're adorable little cartoon characters. No, these are not those grasshoppers. These are to those grasshoppers what a velociraptor is to a gecko. These are horrible monsters that eat everything they find. They eat everything they can get their hands on. They will kill you in a dense enough swarm. They will dead ass. If you catch yourself in a dense enough swarm, you will be so blinded and so caught up in it, you can just fall over dead from them biting you and attacking you. It's holy shit. It is so awful. Locusts, as you can see from that, are very, very feared in regions of Africa where they're an issue. As a matter of fact, if you go up and down the continent of Africa, you will find many stories where locusts are either such an awful natural disaster there's something a great hero has to avert, or they're associated with very powerful, very awful gods and other figures that you can't really apply the term god to. So, anyway, locusts are awful. This is a demonstration over, like the Nile and some other plagues here, a great number of gods. Osiris is very prominent in the pantheon, and one of his greatest responsibilities is holding back hordes of locusts and protecting the Egyptian people from them. But there's also a bunch of other greater gods, and Yahweh is just one-upping all of them by bringing down this horde. It's important to note that we are in the end game, and insofar as plagues that are meant to be a cultural symbol to the Egyptians, like, hey, here's this thing you're really, really scared of that's really, really prominent in your culture. I have power over that. I can throw that at you whenever I want. You should listen to me when I say, let my people go. This is the last of the big ones like that, where Yahweh is making a concerted effort to talk to the Egyptians in their own language, so to speak. He is using things that are culturally inappropriate, my God, culturally important to the Egyptians to send the message of, hey, I'm a big deal, you should listen to me. We now come to the ninth plague, which is darkness. Now, the wording is a little unclear on this. Some people take it to mean God blocked out the sun or took the sun away. And that's a reasonable reading of the text. I believe, and this is just, I don't really have anything to back this up, this is just for the sake of escalation and more or less cool factor. That sounds a little more disrespectful than what I mean, but for the most part, that's what I mean. It's for the sake of it being bombastic and one-upping everything that has come prior. I take it to mean that Yahweh stripped light from the Egyptians. So he didn't just take away the sun. If you were an Egyptian during this period and during this plague, and you went, holy shit, it's supposed to be daytime, there's no sun, I can't see anything, and you went to light a candle or a lantern or something, you would light it, and you would feel the warmth, you would know there was a fire right there, but you still wouldn't be able to see. That's what I think the text means. I think Yahweh stripped the ability for light to be seen by the Egyptians for the period of this plague. And I say that because that is significantly more horrifying. Like, this is even scarier than the rain of fire and the locusts and everything that came before. Imagine you're an Egyptian during this period and there's no sun, and you go to light a light source and there's no light. And you know it's there, you can feel the heat. You heard the shook of your flint and steel or whatever that you use to light your thing. You know it's there, you just still can't see. And your Jewish slaves can see perfectly fine. They might not even be aware there's a plague going on. They can see fine. Like I said, them being afflicted by the plagues stopped with number 3. So they can see just fine. There's a sun for them. There's light for them. But as far as the Egyptians are concerned, Yahweh just took away all light. As far as one-upping the Egyptian gods, this one-ups Ra, who, like I said, got usurped by Isis at a certain point in Egyptian history. So it's not really going up the ladder anymore. It's just doubling back and covering all the bases. Like, hey, just in case you haven't gotten it yet, the old big kahuna of your pantheon, the former number 1, just in case I gotta spell out and go back and specify him too. Yeah, I'm more powerful than him too. This is your last chance. I'm a big deal. Listen to me when I say, let my people go. We finally come to the 10th and most unfortunate plague, the death of all firstborn children. The people are directed to dab the blood of a lamb over their door threshold, and if they do not, their firstborn child died. Now, how specifically that worked isn't made 100% clear. Some people believe that Yahweh sent the angel of death, which is a specific figure in the Old Testament. He shows up later on during Judges, during certain events, and other events throughout the Torah, and I believe once in the Christian New Testament. I believe he shows up at least once. I have to double back and check that. But anyway, some people believe it's the angel of death being sent down to do this. Some people believe it's Yahweh himself taking lives. The specifics don't really matter insofar as our story. It's just important that this is a firstborn child of every family dying if they don't capitulate to Yahweh's directions. This isn't really a display of power over any given god. This is just the coup de grace. This is the last straw. This is, you haven't listened so far. You should have. There's no turning back now. It's also important to note that this is all Pharaoh's fault. Plenty of the Egyptians thought with the Nile turning to blood, hey, we should probably do something about this. Like we can work our own fields. We don't need slaves that bad. And as the plagues went on, more and more people thought, hey, maybe we should listen once fire is raining from the sky. And Pharaoh was still the one going, nah, I don't give a shit. We're not doing anything. And plenty of the Egyptian population capitulated and dabbed the blood of the lamb over their threshold. So this wasn't like a blanket murder of every single firstborn of all Egyptians. This was the murder of all the firstborns of everyone that still wasn't listening after the rain of fire and the locusts and the blotting out of the sun. Which, not to victim blame, but at that point you deserve it. Like, when the slave's God is saying, hey, do what I say, let my people go, and he blots out the sun, you should let his people go. And when he goes, hey, a worse thing than that is coming, you should dab the blood of a lamb over your door to avert it. You should dab the blood of the lamb over your door to avert it. Maybe you should have done that. I don't mean to victim blame, but yeah, that one's on you guys. So that is the 10 plagues of Egypt. With the 10th plague, Pharaoh's son dies as well, and he finally capitulates and lets the Jewish people go. Led by Moses, they go to the Red Sea, who, with Yahweh's power, splits it, and they pass through the parted waves along the seabed. Pharaoh changes his mind and goes, hell no, I want revenge for my son, chases after them with his army, and as the Jewish people get to safety, Yahweh closes the sea back again on Pharaoh and his army, killing them all. And that concludes the arc of the story where the Jewish people are in Egypt. This starts their trek through the wilderness to get to the Promised Land, its own separate story. So, what makes this all so interesting? I talked for 46 minutes and 26 seconds about it. I think this is really cool because it demonstrates its author's familiarity with Egyptian society and religious practices. As I've said throughout all of this, these aren't just grand, bombastic displays of power to show how big and badass Yahweh is. They are, but they're also very directed. They are directed to things that the Egyptians thought culturally important and were important to them, like the river that was the source of their life, and the locusts that were so feared in continental Africa. These were very targeted, directed statements against specific Egyptian gods and goddesses. All throughout the 10 plagues, Yahweh ups the ante and goes up the totem pole, going, hey, this next guy in your worship, I'm stronger than him. Here's a proof of it. You should listen to me when I say it with me, everybody, let my people go. And the fact that it is so structured and so targeted in the narrative, it shows that whoever wrote the story was so familiar with Egyptian life that they could incorporate it into their work. And I think that's fascinating. This could have been so much more simple. This could have been just vague displays of power that Pharaoh doesn't listen to, and then he finally capitulates when it's too much for him. But there was a display of understanding of what is important to Egyptians and how that could be used by a vengeful god to twist Pharaoh's arm into letting his people go. That familiarity and that understanding is much more fascinating than a simple Bible story. And it is so much more interesting as to what it means for the author of the story and what this means to the ancient Jewish people than most people give it credit for. And that's what I like. This is what I find interesting about the Jewish Torah. What can be read into and gleaned insofar as what these stories say about the people that wrote them. I think that's fascinating, and I don't think enough people talk about that. Even if you're not a particularly religious person, you could learn a lot about these ancient peoples based on what they've left us, and they've left us their stories. And I think that's interesting. I think that's fascinating, and in a lot of ways, I think that's beautiful. This is a person who lived thousands of years ago, who I will never meet, who I could never meet, who so little of their life still remains in this world. And I'm learning about what they saw in the world. Through this story, I can see what they saw in another people. That's mind-boggling. This story is a person thousands of years ago telling me about his world, telling you, telling everyone that lives now in the modern day about their world. And that's amazing. That's so great to me. Like it's mind-boggling. I find that really interesting. And I hope you find that interesting too. And I'm happy I could share this almost an hour. I've been talking for almost an hour about this. I'm really happy I could share this with you. And I appreciate you spending so much time with me to let me talk about weird things like this. Thank you very much for spending that time with me. I appreciate it. My name is Elliot Geltz, and I will see you later.